But in 1963, King goes to Birmingham, and it's in Birmingham that really King finds his way. He connects with a local movement in Birmingham, Alabama. King has been the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference since 1957. And basically, SCLC was an organization that tried to mobilize pre-existing local movements. They try in Albany, Georgia, they try in other places, but it's in Birmingham. And King is going to go to jail. He's going to be arrested for trying to be part of a movement that's desegregating the city of Birmingham, Alabama. The citadel of the Confederacy, the city commissioner, Bull Connor, unleashes German shepherds and fire hoses that are powerful enough to tear the bark off of trees in Kelly Ingram Park. And it's in Birmingham that King is going to find his voice. And it's really because of Birmingham that there's going to be enough momentum in the movement to organize a march on Washington that had initially been organized by A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and a very, very important activist, the dean of Black activists of that period. And we're going to see Dr. King in prison write that letter from Birmingham jail. And that letter is going to be very important on scraps of paper that's published later that year. But in that letter, King pushes back against the moderation of white liberals. He pushes back against the white supremacy of racial segregationists. And he says that Black people can't wait for democracy. They can't wait for racial justice. And there's going to be over 1,100 young people who are going to be arrested in Birmingham for nonviolent civil disobedience. And King is going to argue in that letter that those young people who are being arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, are going to be remembered by future generations as heroes for bringing us all back to what King quotes as those great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the founding fathers. So what King does in Birmingham and in the letter from Birmingham jail is connect the civil rights movement to the foundational elements of American democracy, but he does something that's very subversive. He expands and reimagines a democracy where Black women and children and men are constitutive or central elements of that democratic vision and those democratic vistas. So King is really an extraordinary leader in that sense, in terms of he provides us a framework and a rhetoric to reimagine American democracy, despite a brutal history of racial slavery, brutal histories of Reconstruction that is faltered by the rise and the resurgence of white supremacy, convict lease system, sharecropping, peonage, Black codes, and the murder of thousands of Black people, not just through lynching, but through political violence that upends governments in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 and other places. So when we think about King at the March on Washington, it's important for us to get a context of who this King is, this 34-year-old social movement leader who's been in what Malcolm X called the racial wilderness of America over the preceding 7 years, and why he is so confident enough to say at the March on Washington, 250,000 people, August 28th, 1963, he begins that speech by saying, now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. And it's important to understand that he is saying that based on not only what he's been through, but what the movement has been through. The movement pioneers of the grassroots, Black women and men, folks like Ella Baker, who's the organizer of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Fannie Lou Hamer, who's a sharecropper turned activist who gives a courageous, poetic, eloquent testimony at the 1964 Credentials Committee for the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where she talks about the beatings and the violence that activists are facing in rural Mississippi for trying to exercise the right to vote. So King is channeling the pain and the eloquence of those people. And it's important for us to remember who King is and what his role is. So he's not the only activist. In fact, he's the mobilizer who's trying to articulate the wants and needs and vision of millions of people who are on the ground. So the March on Washington is the march for jobs and freedom. This is really crucial. The civil rights movement always was about not just racial justice, but economic justice and redistributive justice. This idea that historically capitalism in the United States had been undergirded by the exploitation of Black people and Black bodies during racial slavery. So racial slavery begets global capitalism, but Black people are left out of having access. Promised 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War, but really relegated to peonage, sharecropping, convict lease, and exploitation, both in the South, but also when they tried to migrate to northern cities as well. King talks about reparations at the March on Washington. We come here to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of Opportunity in America is bankrupt. When King talks about that, cashing that check, people really don't understand what he means by that. King constantly talks about racial slavery in his speeches. He constantly talks about violence and lynching that happened to African Americans in the early 20th century and continues to happen in the context of the 1950s and 60s. At the March on Washington, King says that the governors of Alabama and Mississippi, their lips are dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. These were the words of the Calhoun conservatives, the white supremacists of the pre-Civil War era that placed the nation on the precipice of disaster and led to a 4-year conflict where over 700,000 Americans perished. King talks about that. King talks about the violence and the humiliation and the embarrassment of Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is in his backyard. And Stone Mountain is really the symbol of the renewed Klan that emerges in 1915 in the United States and is still around in Georgia and really is an embarrassment and a treasonous blight on the body politic. King talks about that. King says that Alabama and Mississippi are states filled with vicious racists in the I Have a Dream speech. And in that speech, King says that people are going to have to struggle together, but they're going to have to go to jail together. In the March on Washington speech, you only have to go to jail when you are pursuing social justice in an unjust society. You don't go to jail in a just society when you are pursuing social justice. So the I Have a Dream speech is an extraordinary speech, but we ignore the parts that make us uncomfortable. We ignore the facets of King's political thought and his rhetoric that is facing squarely the depth and breadth of anti-Black racism and white supremacy in our politics, in our structures, in our institutions, in our systems, in our culture. So it's really important for us when we think about Dr. King and Martin Luther King Jr. and what does he mean to understand those aspects of his vision.